兄弟们，守不住了。
听我说，如果你们的亲人在那些卡车上，现在就可以去把他们领回来。
Hello, welcome to Movie Umpers. My name is Bob Sham.
My name is Angela.
The sounds of your maybe dogs. This month, it's one of our most knee-slapping themes we've ever discussed is Glory and Propaganda. That is war movies all month long. And this week is World War II week. Though if you want to get technical, the Second Sino-Japanese War, which is what this covers, is not technically a part of it. Like, it would be its own thing if the rest of the globe did not break out into war. It plays right into it all. It all goes together. There's just a decade of fucked up shit right before the global war breaks out, right? And this was a part of all of it. This is our first Chinese-made film. We're probably not going to be talking about a lot of Chinese movies. And similar to Come and See, which was like a Soviet movie, but this is separate. And this movie came out in 2009, and it's called, at least the English adapted title is City of Life and Death. Its original title was Nanking, Nanking. It's directed by Liu Chan, written by Liu Chan, starring Liu Ye, Gao Wanwan, Fan Wei, Quin Lan, Nakazumi Hideo, and Zhang Yiyan. You'll remember those names, right?
I think you did that perfectly.
Yeah.
I would just like to say.
As good as these white lips can do it in this moment. We talk about these so-called communist nations, and how they like to be very particular about their art, their movies that come out. It's not untrue. But a lot of what they like and what they prefer is probably a lot more of the fist-pumping, rah-rah patriotic stuff, in which the United States has tons of that shit. This movie covers the horrifying event in which the Japanese government overtook the then capital city of Nanking in China. What is often called the Rape of Nanking, in which the Japanese killed millions of Chinese when it was all said and done. By the time this whole thing was over, China was in the middle of a civil war. There was a revolution in process, and the nationalists and the communists had to stop because the Japanese were fucking coming, and we're like, okay, we gotta fight the fucking Japanese. Wow. And so by 1945, when it was all said and done, the Japanese surrendered after we nuked the fuck out of them. Then they picked it right back up, and then the communists finished off their revolution. What is it that the Japanese doesn't have to pay for what they did compared to what the Germans did? One, because the Germans did it to other Europeans. That's probably a big difference, right? The Japanese, they did it to the Chinese. And the Japanese were like the imperial monsters of the East. And also, Japanese developed this very prolific media presence. There's something that the Japanese do, especially in multimedia, that we all like at this point, right? And it just gives them the opportunity to glaze right past. Also, we dropped the fucking nuclear bombs on them, which kind of allows them to concentrate on that, which is a genuine atrocity. That's what we can focus on when it comes to the Japanese side of things in World War II, right?
It definitely seems as though the rest of the world said, oh, that's their problem. Mm-hmm. Like those countries, they can deal with that. That's theirs. And then, whereas if someone else had done those things, another country had done those things, we might step in. But if we say anything, they can go, bomb. It totally makes sense that we would not want to draw any more attention, but it is what it is, right?
Sure.
Like,
it's not in the United States' best interest to drag out the rape of Nanking as some thing that we should all be ultra conscious about, right? What's interesting about this movie that stands out is that a lot of the movie is horrifying, but much of it comes from the perspective of Japanese soldiers, which is something that you might not expect in a Chinese-funded movie. There's a character, Kadakawa Masao, and he's a guy that's, he's in the Japanese army, but he seems completely unsure about all the horrible things that are happening. He's there to fight a war. He's not hesitant about fighting army against army.
And he's a sergeant.
But once people start becoming lined up and raped and shit like that, then it's shaking him. He becomes almost like the come and see kid in some ways. But he's Japanese, and this is representing a sympathetic Japanese soldier who's becoming traumatized by what his own countrymen are doing. And there's also these notions of where when the Japanese are to themselves and they're like playing on their own, they're singing songs about how they want to go back to their home nation. It spreads the humanity not just amongst the horrors that happen to the Chinese people, but it also gives a little bit of humanity to the Japanese people that are doing all this themselves, which I think was very surprising when this movie came out in 2009, based on perceptions of what a government like China would put out into the world. Because in reality, Japan itself is notorious for completely ignoring their role in how they played during this conflict. They are very notorious for not talking about it at all. Japan is more likely to censor this thing than China is,
Yeah.
And as hard as this movie goes, it could go even harder from some things that I've read. There was also this center that the Japanese built where they experimented on Chinese people and just did horrible things similar to what the Nazis did in concentration camps, experimenting on Jewish prisoners and gypsy prisoners and shit like that. So, yeah, this movie could have went way hard.
Our Mr. Rabe, was that his name? He's a Nazi.
Yeah, he's a German guy, but they're in, as I understand it, it's supposed to be a safety zone, almost like that. Similar to maybe what the international zone was in The Third Man. I think the idea is that it's supposed to be like that.
And he seemed to be there helping to
Mr.
keep
Tang.
that secure.
He had a secretary, Mr. Tang, who's being assisted by his wife, and so he's employed this little family to help assist
And then there's a
him.
couple other people as well, like Ms. Zhang.
Yeah.
And there's an American woman.
Yeah,
There's this group of people who, once we get to that part, do seem to be... We see them at the very beginning drive through this area in these cars. And they're going somewhere. They're going through this war zone. They're not stopping in there, and they're going to that space.
Well, we see Japan starting off just shelling the walls and getting in. And it was a little confusing at first, but when we see the herd of troops coming up while the other troops are arm in arm trying to keep them from leaving, both of those are all Chinese soldiers. And the ones by the door are begging these other soldiers to not leave. And the other soldiers are like, our commanding officers have fled. We need to get the fuck out of here. But of course they get out that door and the Japanese are there. They start fucking shit up. The urban warfare depicted in this movie, it's very bizarre. I think I really like movies that depict urban warfare, or at least I love scenes of good urban warfare. Yeah. And this is shot very well, like the way the battles do. And I know you go back and forth on the representations of war. There is a lot of hand cam, shaky cam. I think Saving Private Ryan popularized that. It didn't invent it, but after Saving Private Ryan, it was a lot more common that you'd get the hand cam thing. And there was a little bit of that here, but I don't think it was overdone. What did you think about the war shots?
I actually thought it was very well done. This was easy for me to watch. 'Cause I know I've made the comment before. Sometimes when it is shaky and sometimes when they're moving around too fast, it's like it's too much for me to take in. But I think this was shot very well. I think it was set up very well.
And we see some Chinese soldiers, particularly a boy, feeding artillery to a man. And that boy's going to come play in later, but that man will end up dying, of course, very bravely standing up to the Japanese soldiers.
That was so impactful because that little boy is right next to him, and the little boy, they'd been tied up, and there's a group of folks in front of them who are about to get killed. and the little boy like bit the man's
ropes off.
But the man didn't try to go anywhere. He knew there was nowhere to go. What he did was he covered the little boy's eyes so he didn't have to see it. But then when they told them all to stand, no one wanted to stand because they didn't want to die. And he was like, I'll stand. And the little boy walks with him. And then these other men that we kind of get to know start walking with him. And it's just this, facing the fate you cannot escape.
A lot of this first half hour of the movie, or a little more, is just the Japanese rounding up the Chinese prisoners where they need to be, putting people in specific places. A lot of these people that are supposed to be representing a safety zone, having to argue about their position and where they can be for safety, people trying to find their families. And of course, these Chinese soldiers just coming to the realization that this will be certain death. And then we get to a point where we walk down the street and we see dismembered heads hanging off ropes and shit. I mean, it really rides the line, but it doesn't show the violence in a measure that is overtly exploitive. Apparently there's a Chinese-made movie called like The Men of the Sun that is ultra violent, ultra exploitive about this kind of thing, and that unit that did a lot of experimentations. But even the Chinese government disavows that, even though it's totally about Japanese atrocities, which they usually definitely want to talk about. But yeah, there is like some ultra violent exploitive movies that talk about this. But this movie does a good job of showing the atrocities without feeling that exploitation.
Often doesn't show the actual act. It's more the precursor and the aftermath of the terrible thing. Like, you'll see stacks of dead bodies. In that beginning scene, we actually see a bunch of folks being buried alive.
That's fucked up.
And that is so fucked up.
I'd read once that the Japanese soldiers were having like beheading contests to see how many people they could behead in certain amounts of time.
Man.
Yeah, it's jacked up. And then there's raping like crazy. You get all the prisoners of war. We see all people gathered into this place and all these Chinese prisoners, and they just mow them all down. They just machine gun the fuck out of every single one of them.
The little boy somehow miraculously survives. He
and another man, they're like the only survivors, and they kind of fake their death. They flop, which is exactly what I would have done. Like, oh, I'm dead. And
Absolutely.
Just stay the fuck down. Don't move.
Absolutely. And they make it to the safe zone. Mr. Tang's wife, or Miss Zhang, Miss Zhang is more in charge.
Yeah.
And she kind of takes him under her wing because she realizes he's been through so much. And you just often see him sort of near her, right? Like, you can just tell she's protecting him. We don't get to know these people very specifically, but it's really interesting the moments that we do.
Apparently these are all based on real people, even the Japanese soldiers.
Yeah, they were saying, they kind of give you, and at the end tell you what happened to everyone.
After all this is established, or after these atrocities are processed, I suppose, then things start to kind of settle into a proper occupation. And that's when we come back after some time and we're visiting these people that have negotiated their peace. All the prisoners have been killed, at least as far as they know, every single one of them. And it's just these civilians. So it's people trying to stand up, trying to identify as civilians in order to not be killed, and also trying to negotiate their livelihood under Japanese occupation.
Mr. Tang is trying to teach them all how to say, I am a civilian in Japanese. Our young sergeant,
Mr. Katakawa, he goes to a comfort woman. She's very Japanese.
Beautiful, and he sits down and she touches his penis and he ejaculates immediately.
He comes trying to put the condom on.
Well, what it is he can't get it on, and she says, hand it to me. And as she's putting the condom on, he ejaculates. I think because the contact of her touching his penis, he can't handle it.
That's the first time he's ever been with a woman.
When she says to him, is this your first time? And he says yes, because he's very apologetic. She's very sweet to him. And they kiss a lot, and they have sex, and he leaves and tells one of his other guys, I'm going to marry that woman.
Yeah.
So he has this image of this woman in his head.
He has this attachment now in the middle of all this, and I think it helps him cope with the atrocities that his countrymen are doing here. But he has, this woman becomes a tether in his mind. And as he goes back to her, you can tell that she's like polite to him, like she doesn't dislike him.
She doesn't remember him more than any other guy.
But she's not as emotionally tethered to him as he is to her.
Yeah. He tries to say, like, this is who I am, and she's like, okay.
So at one point, they got this guy, Raby, who's a German. And he's, of course, the Japanese are allied with the Germans, so he's doing a lot of pull to get people to safety and maintain their safety. But eventually, Germany comes calling for him because they tell him, like, you protecting Chinese people is not helping our relationship with Japan. So why don't you come the fuck home? And explains to Mr. Tang, and Mr. Tang is obviously very frightened for his family. And so he makes the choice, knowing that Raby's not going to be there to protect him. He happens to know where there are some soldiers that are alive being treated. And he rats them out to the Japanese forces. And they go in this room and they fucking smear these guys just as they're like laying in their bed. There's one guy that shoots himself rather than be taken or tortured by the Japanese.
And they had given Mr. Tang this piece of paper that's supposed to buy him and his family protection. And one of the things that they did early on is they made all the women cut their hair really short and start wearing men's clothes to make them less attractive, hopefully to not be assaulted. And they get into this room where the women are, and Mr. Tang is there and his wife and his little daughter. And they don't give a shit. He starts to pull out his paper, and the little girl is crying, and this soldier literally takes this child and throws her out of an upstairs window and kills her.
And let this be a lesson in what giving concessions to what you think your enemy wants to placate them, especially in American politics, especially when people are so driven by this state of mental superiority, this racial superiority. They believe they're sanctified by God and their ancestors. They really, much like the Nazis, the Japanese believed that they were the superior race, especially as they would go all over Eastern Asia, wreaking havoc as they did for hundreds of years. And you can't compromise with that. And I know he's just trying to save his immediate family, but all he ended up accomplishing was just getting probably 100 more people fucking killed.
Well, and a bunch of women raped. So
many raped to death.
What happened was, they basically told him, "Fuck you, we don't care about your paper," and they kill all these men. And then they tell them, they're like, "But this is the safe zone. We're supposed to be safe here." And they say, "Okay, you can be safe, and we'll even make sure your supplies can get through to you. Otherwise, we'll stop them. What you have to do for us is give us women for 3 weeks.
100 women.
To be comfort women, and we will return them after 3 weeks." And this scene, so much of this just is like gutting, right? But this part where Miss Zhang and Mr. Raby, they have to stand up at the front and explain to them what's going on. And they're begging these women to volunteer to do this, or they're saying this is what's going to happen. It's one of those things where we have to go willingly or they're going to force it. There's
one woman who talks at the beginning of how she refuses to cut her hair because
she has nail polish on.
She's going to have to figure out how to feed herself. She volunteers for this. And then one by one, several women raise their hand to volunteer for this.
And they take them into the place where they're at looks actually very much like a hospital. There's just very thin, like cloth walls between each of these beds where these women are just laying there in like rags.
And the Japanese are selling them. $5 for Japanese women, $2 for Chinese and Korean.
Yeah, and these men are just going in and having their way with these women. These women are starving. the guys will sometimes bring them in like rice balls, and you see them just like choking them down, like they can't eat fast enough. Once they realize they're gonna let them have it, they're beat up. Our sergeant
Katakawa, he comes to see his lady Yuriko,
and he doesn't have sex with her. He sits there and he's like, how did you get here?
Yeah,
why are you here? And she can't even talk to him. Like
it's like she's like, I'm a comfort girl.
Well, she's just, there's no point in her even answering him.
She's just numb.
She's also, they're all glazed over. Like they have to just, they're trying to just get through this
and
survive.
And as he's talking to her, another guy comes up. He's like, "Are you done? Can I do?" And he like fucks her right in front of him. Yeah. It's pretty warped up, but Katakawa is then out in this courtyard and he sees a guy with a wheelbarrow piled with naked women. Like some of these women are being raped to death or probably just tortured and killed because no one gives a fuck. But Yuriko also dies in this process. And when he comes in to see her, it's kind of the beginning of where he's going to be going by the end of the movie. This woman, even as a Japanese woman, did not make it through because she's a prostitute. So they maybe see her better as a Chinese woman, but not as good as they are, right?
This is the part where it's time to take the women back. So there's a very small group of women left. And he starts acting protective of them to a point. There's one woman who's obviously lost her mind and she's singing and on the steps. And this other guy kills her. And he's like, why did you do that? She was beautiful. You know, he's seeing them as people. But also you realize in that moment, the fact that he's seeing them as people and now letting people around him know that they're not going to stand for that for very long, you know?
In the process of Raby leaving and people leaving and people are being separated, like there's a lot of prisoners and they're being separated from their family. So they give them the opportunity to rescue one family member. So Miss Zhang, she kind of does these little disguises. She's going around and doing the best she can to save as many people as they possibly can.
But she fucked it all up.
In Tang, he ends up with that same deal. He ends up sending his wife and one of his surviving relatives.
It's the other assistant. Mr. Raby has 2 assistants, and we don't know the other one very well, but Tang decides to let the other assistant and his wife go. His wife's pregnant. We found that out.
Yeah. So Tang, he does manage to save his wife and their assistant.
And he's sacrificing himself. He tries to tell his wife, like, I'll continue looking for your sister because her sister's one of the ones that died who went. And he knows he's not going to, but also, like, he knows that them raiding the safe zone and doing this whole attack was his fault. So
Miss Zhang she gets busted for trying to rescue more than one. And there's this other commanding officer who's kind of the foil for Katakawa's traumatized viewing of all this. He's another guy that just doesn't give a fuck, who's more like the Japanese brass. He spots Miss Zhang and he's like, all right, I guess our men are going to have a good time with you, right? And so they start to walk on and she says something.
Shoot me.
And then Katakawa, as they're dragging, basically Mercy kills Miss Zhang and shoots her in the back of the head as they're dragging her off to go be probably raped to death. Yeah. So Katakawa does that. She's dead anyway. So he just made sure that she goes faster.
And we see Mr. Tang shot.
Before we get to this last end bit, which is fucking amazing, we can't tell because we don't read these regional Asian accents. We're not sure what's being good or not. I feel like some of the English actors do, the Western actors, like the guy who's supposed to be German sounds American most of the time. Like it's not the acting, the accents that we know are not really sold that great. I'm sure a lot of what they're doing as Japanese accents is probably not that amazing either. I mean, you got a lot of Chinese people playing Japanese people, right? So there's some elements of the acting that the parts that you can tell is like, oh, well, this probably isn't too good. Although the shots and the way the movie is made and everything itself seemed really high end for the most part. But we sit through this movie, right? We're watching all these horrifying things happen. And then the Japanese soldiers line up. Hajime! And they start hitting drums. And God help me if this beat wasn't sick as shit. Like I watch these guys do some of the worst things you can possibly do to other human beings. And then they bust out these drum beats and I'm watching this movie like, oh! We got up off the couch and we fucking busted our ass to these sick drum beats.
We did not do that.
There was one point,
we did mention that it was a good beat.
There was one point because the beat was so good that you looked at me and was like, I forgive Japan.
I did not.
I forgive them. Very well done. Very well shot. Like this last 5 to 10 minutes is great. And then we see after the sick drum beats are done, Kadakawa is walking the boy and the man who had survived the initial culling.
And he was not a soldier. He worked with those folks. He was like a secretary and an assistant. Yeah.
Kadakawa is walking them out beyond the walls of the city along with another Japanese soldier. And the expectation that the kid and the man have is that they're going to be executed outside the city.
They're walking, like holding each other.
Kadakawa stops and he tells them, start going. Start walking. And they're just walking and they're expecting to get hit by bullets. Kadakawa, he's a commanding officer over this guy.
Well, first he says to him, it's easier to live than to die.
So the man, he's confused and he just starts to walk. And then as the boy and the man are far away, Kadakawa pulls out a pistol, shoots himself in the head, and he rolls down into an embankment. The boy and the man realize they're like checking to see if they got shot.
Other, yeah.
And they realize that they weren't shot. So what do? You don't sprint away from Nanking as fast as possible. You start making flower jewelry. You start putting it all over your face. This part, I mean, I love this ending is great, but they were so fucking happy, and I'm just like, get the fuck away. Go inland as fast as you possibly can.
Okay, I didn't think any of that happened immediately.
Oh, you thought it was like maybe...
It was more of a montage. We didn't see them making any of that jewelry. Like, they were, like, traveling then farther and farther away, realizing that they got to be alive. So, I mean, they did pick up, like, some dandelions.
Yeah, they picked up dandelions. It's like, yes. I mean, I get it. They're so happy to live that they...
But I also understand what you're saying. Like, run.
It's just like, yo, you're not done. Go, right? But they were celebrating their life.
Yeah, and you end on the shot of the little boy laughing.
And Kadakawa is dead in the ditch because he can't bear...
He can't do any anymore.
To live with what he has been a part of.
And then we find out at the end, they give everybody's what happened, not what happened to them, but you know, how long they lived, things like that. And the little boy at the time was still alive.
In 2009, this came out, so he was alive at that time.
Yeah.
The Japanese soldier who was a lot more evil apparently lived into the 80s.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the Chinese film City of Life and Death / Nanking Nanking from 2009, directed by Lu Chuan. This might be the peak toughest we get We got a movie about the America bombing Japan by the end of this week. So, but this should be the roughest week. I don't know. There's Waltz with Bashir, which is an atrocity by Israeli and Lebanese forces. So we'll be talking about that one later in the month as well. But yeah, it's a rough month. God bless America. I hope you all had a happy 4th of July. And thank you, China, for all the explosives you give us to celebrate on this special day. This is really a China and the United States working together for our most patriotic day. Thank you, China. We're going to give this 1 through 5 each, combined for best out of 10. I think this movie's a solid 4.
I'm going to give it a 4.5.
That is an 8.5. Check it out, folks. Our first Chinese film, City of Life and Death by Liu Chuan from 2009, rests between Tim Burton's Batman and the Ingmar Bergman. I misspelled his name, I just noticed. Cries and Whispers. So it's between Batman and Cries and Whispers where it belongs. It's at least as good as those movies, if not better. Sad shit for the rest of the week. Glory and propaganda, that's the theme. So it's war movies. And next month probably won't be much lighter. We're talking about dystopian sci-fi movies. So it's a sad boy summer. That's what we're calling it. Sad boy summer. Anyway, check the show notes for links, other places to find us. Like, subscribe, leave a comment. We like it when you do that. You can find this movie online. Never forget to check the show notes. If I can find a link to the movie, I will link it. But sometimes links can be outdated. They can get taken down. So just understand that if you're coming across it a little late. But this movie is fairly easy to find. All right, so that said, let's get out of here.
Let's hear it for the boys.
The Japanese boys?
No, I don't like saying it on this one.